and also provide an overview of the Sisters Project, how we're working with women that are engaged in street sex work in Milwaukee, and including some of the data that we've been able to find for this particular project. And finally,
you might want to just ask questions while you're talking.
Sure.
Wait till the end.
No, you can ask questions as
So
I go.
you said you're saying street sex. So when you bring these women in, or when they come in, how do they identify themselves? What do they say that their line of work is, or do they say? Is it for them? Is it I'm a prostitute? Is it for them? This is a way of life. My kids or whatever. I got to get to school. How do the women identify themselves? I mean, I hear what you're saying, but what do they say? Who do they say? Yeah, this is what I do.
This is what I do.
But how do they? Is that what they say?
Yes.
This is what I do. I'm a prostitute.
This is what I do. They don't say I'm a prostitute.
Okay.
But women will say this is what I do. Generally, women will not say that they have a pimp. That's a word that folks don't like to use. A lot of the men won't necessarily call themselves a pimp. But the woman will say,
Big Dad?
I'm her man. And a woman might say, I have a man. I have someone that takes care of me.
Okay.
So we found that when engaging with the women, when they come in, that we have to ask very specific questions. Because generally, if you ask, do you have a pimp, she'll probably say no. And it could be because maybe she really doesn't. There are some women that really are on their own and do this and then keep the money that they bring in, but more likely than not, they have somebody that's controlling them. So generally, you have to ask very specific questions. Do you have someone that you bring your money to? Do you have somebody that knows where you are at all times? That's what, you have to ask very specific questions. But you generally, the woman will say, "What's this? It's just what I do. It's what I do." And finally, the lessons learned from utilizing a partnership to address violence as a public health issue. A lot of times violence is not talked about as a public health issue, as something that can actually be prevented. But for all of the women that are involved in the work, they're exposed to an extreme amount of violence. And they also are aware of that as well. But the idea that when working on the streets, they're exposed to either violence from their man, from the men that might be picking them up, the Johns, so to speak. Good morning. Or to random individuals as well, and I'll talk about that, some of the violence that the women are exposed to. So the way we approach our work is heavy on advocacy. The women already are stigmatized and criminalized. This is not a talk to say that prostitution should be legalized or anything like that. That's a whole different, I think, conversation. It doesn't focus on the women as much. When we were getting funding for this particular project, one of the things that the reviewers came back to us with is, well, this is great, but why don't you focus on the men? Why don't you focus on the Johns that are picking the women up? And it's a fair question, but one of the challenges is that it doesn't talk about the things that the women need. It doesn't change the fact that the women need healthcare access, that the women need health services, or that the women somehow need to be protected from the environment that they're currently in. So it's not to say that it's not important to address what's going on with the men that are picking up the women, but it's important to focus on their needs as well. So a little bit of background, because I don't assume to know what folks already know about this or not, but a few important points that I wanted to emphasize. One is that female street sex workers are an extremely disadvantaged group with histories of loss. I don't know if anyone was at the sessions yesterday afternoon that talked about women in traumatic relationships, but just listening to that was everything that I thought of with this particular project. The women that are engaged in this work, especially the women that we're working with, are women that have backgrounds of traumatic relationships, usually traumatic family relationships. They've been abused and sexualized since they were very young. I emphasize with folks that these are not women that woke up one day when they turned 18 and said, I think I'm going to choose this. Because a lot of folks say, well, why don't people just choose something different? When in fact that, when you've been sexualized your entire life, some of the women have been turned out by family members. It's not as though they were adults and then got hooked up with the wrong guys, so to speak. For some of the women, unfortunately, family members can do this to you as well. You can have someone in your own family turn you out for money. So So the women have histories of loss. And some of them are also mothers. And unfortunately, these are also some women that have lost their children, no longer have custody, or gave up their kids for whatever reason. So a lot of them have just these extreme histories of loss. And a lot of that does not get captured in the research when talking about female street sex workers. A lot of times, what you see in the research about street sex workers is as carriers of disease. We have to address prostitution because that's how we can help control HIV/AIDS spreading in the community. So it's almost presented in public health like vector control, which is really, it's really odd, when in fact a lot of the women are victims and have their own histories. Also, high levels of stigma, poverty, and violence. I mentioned stigma already, but this is not a topic that gets talked about a whole lot, especially within public health, as important as it is. We're not talking about what women are exposed to when they're out when they're on the streets, whether they're exposed to violence from families or from their men, so to speak, or from other individuals. So we're just not talking about this. It's just not something that is lifted up. And I'll address this also with the implications of this work, but also that women do have higher rates of drug use and HIV risk and mental health. And some of that is a coping mechanism. When we have women that come into our drop-in center off the street, if they've been brought in by the police, chances are they're probably coming down off of a high, and that's really challenging. So if a woman's coming in and they're high, the last thing they want to do is talk to you about anything. So we have to find ways when supporting the women that we're finding ways of providing for them what they're not already getting from their man or from the street. So it's not just enough to say, hey, you got to lead this life, but what are the things that we can provide to women, whether it's substance abuse counseling or mental health counseling, the things that they need that can help them exit the life that they're in. Because exiting takes a long time. For some, actually the average age of the women in one of our groups is 43. So we're not talking about young women that, in their early 20s. These are women that this is probably all they have done. One of our outreach workers, Donna, has just incredibly sobering but amazing stories of some of the women that she's working with. And the women are saying, look, this is all I've done. So whatever you're offering, if you can give me some job skills or help me get my GED or get through college, whatever it is, because this is all I've done. Some women don't necessarily have identification. That's also a form of control. So the women don't have IDs, anything that would allow them to leave. So when you think about the trauma that women go through in an abusive relationship, it's the same thing that we see in women exiting sex work, because chances are there is somebody that's controlling them, and it's not easy for them to leave that life. And finally, it's not a victimless crime. This comes up, I think, in conversations about legalization. Well, it's not really hurting anybody. You've got someone where, this is an economic transaction. You got a man or perhaps a woman that's paying, someone's giving a service. What's the harm in that? Well, obviously, there's a lot of harm for the women that are involved, because unfortunately for many of them, they're in extremely dangerous situations. And it does affect the women and their families, not to mention the men also that are involved. So it's not a victimless crime. One thing, as I mentioned earlier, that it's not a clear choice. I hear this word quite a bit when I talk to some of my colleagues that are in public health but don't necessarily work with women that are in street sex work. It's not a clear choice, so to speak. These are, for a lot of the women, like I said, not only is there a history of severe trauma in their families, but just this feeling of overall hopelessness. Like I said, if the average age of one of the women is 43, you figure, well, this is what I do, this is what it is. What can you tell me? What can you do for me that's going to be any different, that's going to change what I've already experienced? And so one of the challenges is in unpackaging all of the layers of trauma that women have experienced. And I'll talk through one of the programs that we have on women's sexuality. But it's really trying to undo a lot of the thinking that women have. And again, like I said, this isn't something that happens once women are 18 years old and all of a sudden choose to do this. For a lot of the women, there's never been a conversation, a safe place to have a conversation and talk about whatever it is that happened in one's childhood or with previous relationships that got her to this particular point where this was what the work that she was doing. So it's very difficult to have, I think, sometimes the conversation about it because it's not the choice that I think sometimes folks think that it is for the women. And also there are neighborhood and community effects. For the neighborhood that we work in specifically, which actually is not too far from where I live, there are negative consequences for the community residents, and there's a concern. We had a community meeting a couple of months ago, and the residents were saying, you know, we're concerned about our granddaughters. There was one woman, I won't forget, this is a grandmother in the community, and said, what do I do when my 15-year-old is getting approached when she stands on the corner in the morning, 7 a.m. waiting for the bus? And there's a man that keeps circling the block and wanting to approach her. And this is a man that knows this is not a grown woman. He knows this is a child. But she's talking about, you know, what do I do when I've got someone that's approaching my granddaughter? So there are women in the community that are concerned about their daughters, their grandchildren, and the harassment that goes on with that. And of course the safety concerns. You know, if a young girl can't even stand and wait for the school bus on the morning, then what can be done for her? She's being, you know, she's in a home where maybe she can't get a ride to school, or the only way she can get to school is waiting for the bus, which should be safe. I stood on the corner too and waited for the school bus. So there's the concern about the harassment that the young girls face. And children witnessing sexual acts. I think sometimes when you think about women in street sex work, you think of something that happens at 2 in the morning when everyone's asleep and and it's dark out. The hot spot hours for the community in which we're working is 6 to 10 in the evening. So there's plenty of there's cars going by. It's a main thoroughfare, and it can, folks are getting off work. It's 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock, and these things are happening, or they're happening in the early morning hours when businesses are opening up too. So that's also the concern in the area, that they don't want children witnessing. Unfortunately, kids pick up things pretty quick, and they know something's going on when a car is slowing down and a woman is stopping in the window. And finally, the loss of business and property devaluation. We have some of our businesses in the community that are saying, I'm concerned when there's someone standing right outside my business and I've got my workers or patrons trying to come in and they know what's happening. Some of our businesses have taken to putting out signs about solicitation and if you witness acts of prostitution, call the police at this number. So we've got businesses that are concerned about what's happening and that it can devalue their business or the surrounding property. The challenge, though, is that the traditional criminal justice system doesn't take into account a lot of the things that I've talked about. It's very black and white, so to speak. The response is usually about, okay, this is an illegal act. State statute, city statute says this is illegal, so if I see a woman that's flagging someone down, if I see a man that's slowing down and she's stopping there, that's probable cause that there's something else happening, and I have a right to handcuff her or to ticket her or to ticket him, and there's an arrest, and that's it. And the challenge, of course, is if you're not addressing all these underlying issues, it just becomes this cycle. So the fine in Milwaukee for that is $600 for the woman. Well, who's paying a $600 ticket? She'll probably get a ticket, but does that get paid, or is it the tickets add up? And then there's a warrant out for your arrest, so you can be arrested, and maybe you get bailed out. Hopefully you get bailed out, but then you're out, and then what happens? It happens all over again. So that's the concern that residents have. It's like they don't want it in the neighborhood. Folks don't want to be exposed to it, so to speak, but they don't want to see the same lady that they saw get picked up last week out on the street 2 weeks later. So there are concerns about, is the criminal justice system really taking care of anything other than arrest, rinse and repeat, so to speak. So as I said, then the result is more criminal arrests, and unfortunately then now a woman has a record, and the worst thing that would happen to her is to get a state charge. That doesn't happen as often, but now we've got an attorney general that's really trying to crack down on this, so they figure, well, a state charge will take care of it. And unfortunately, a state charge, once that is on your record, it's almost impossible to get housing. It's very difficult to get any sort of financial assistance or housing assistance once you've got a state charge on your record. And how do you get really decent employment if you've got to check the box that says you have a record, which might be different if you've got municipal citations. So again, what are we doing then to support the women that are going through this? So one thing I wanted to emphasize, which sort of leads into our particular program, is an alternative to correction. So the main thing is that There's the potential for cost effectiveness with alternative to correction, benefits women's and communities. Unfortunately, a lot of folks may not be as on board about all of the traumatic healing and all the important things that have to happen to a woman to make her whole, to exit the life. But people hear you when you talk about cost effectiveness. And all of a sudden, maybe this can save the criminal justice system some money if you're not having to arrest women and bring them in, and then all of a sudden they're out again, and you have to due process, all of that. That all costs money. There was a study done by the FBI that found that up to $16 million a year gets spent enforcing prostitution laws and addressing negative outcomes. And that's a lot of money that perhaps, you know, if we had funding for other programs that actually benefited the women involved, we wouldn't have to spend. And I propose, isn't it less expensive perhaps to provide safe housing, healthcare, substance abuse treatment, and case management, as opposed to spending millions of dollars in law enforcement? There are 3 different programs I wanted to note. There's a term that gets used in criminal justice called deferred prosecution agreement or diversion program. The idea is that an individual may receive a ticket or might receive a charge, but if they go through a series of programs, that ticket then can be waived. And it might look different in different places, but in doing some little bit of background work, even before our project got started, I found 3 different, this is not the only, of course, there's one in Minneapolis too, I believe, but 3 different cities that are doing more of this to address prostitution. One is in Dallas, the Prostitution Diversion Initiative. They have a 47% recidivism, basically meaning was there any new charge after women went through a particular program. 47% is very good. Usually, I know the average in Milwaukee for prostitution, the average recidivism rate is about 80%. So 80% of the women that are criminally charged, processed, incur a new charge within a certain period of time. So 47%, at least compared to where we are, that's pretty good. But they found there's still a need for this long-term case management, which is to the issues I was speaking of earlier. There's just a lot of work that has to be done with women. It's not that you can do this, send them through a program for 2 or 3 weeks and everything is okay. It takes longer than that. They also developed a new Texas law that counties with more than 200,000 residents have to have a diversion program. Of course, that costs money. So I think they're going to need state funding in order to be able to do that successfully. But again, this idea that, you know, cities with at least that size should be able to fund a program for a diversion process. They're more in the pilot stage in Seattle, but they also have a diversion program there that 90% of the women accept a diversion. A woman doesn't have to accept it. If you're the assistant DA can look at the charge and choose to offer a diversion program. It might depend on her own background. Maybe if this is a first-time charge or she's only been charged a few times or arrested a few times in the past, they'll offer a diversion, but she doesn't have to accept it. A woman can say, I'll take my chances with the ticket, or I'll go to trial with it. But a diversion program is usually pretty heavy duty. It means some form of case management, substance abuse training, counseling, rather not training, or other, you know, group therapy type options, and that's not something that a lot of women may choose to do, or they may not be in a position to do that, because it also means that you have to somehow remove yourself from whoever's controlling you, and that's very difficult for the women that are involved. And finally, there's a program in Phoenix called Project Rose that has social service programs for women, and they've got a very low recidivism at only 14.5% after 1 year, and they can demonstrate that they've got the cost savings for this. And by the way, I can email my slides to you as well.
Yes, please.
I've worked with HIV/AIDS and community-based organizations and worked with this population. And so when we look at not just the Johns, but the pimps and the controlling factor, that's a big piece in trying to get them out of the life. And so is there a component that really looks at enforcement against the pimps? And because when you try to do this, I can see right now I'm not ready to deal with drugs. That's just too big. I mean, somebody in the legal system needs to deal with that. But right now, that control, the unbelievable control that these men have over us, for you to, you know, it's one thing to go into business and sell your body and keep the money, but they're making nothing and these men are keeping a lot of it. So it's, and they're believing that this is love. That's what's so scary about it, because this is all they've seen all their life, this trauma and everything. This is love, somebody's taking care of me. So what is happening and what you're seeing to get them in any of these programs? We have to get them from under the control. We have to empower them to separate themselves from these men. And that's been for strong black women talking to other black women. You have to really control yourself and make sure that you're respectful of where they are. Because you feel like saying, look, baby, come on, I'm trying to do this for you, but you gotta cut him loose. You can't go there because you're gonna lose him. So how do you work them to get them where they're more empowered in themselves and some kind of law, because they can get killed.
Absolutely.
Because that's money for this man.
It's, for the work that we're doing, and I'm going to talk about this too with the Sisters Project, it starts with the street outreach and meeting the women where they are. We've got the street outreach workers that are involved, have been in the life themselves, and it takes numerous times to see the women on the street to just say, how about you come into the drop-in center, just for a little bit, get something to eat, rest. But it takes a while even to get them into the drop-in center. The women have to see that what you're offering is somehow going to be, one, better than what they've got, if they perceive that what they've got is, feels pretty good to them. But it's that somehow what you're offering is going to be better than, like I said, better than what they're currently getting, and that somehow you can help improve their life where they're at. And that's tough. That's tough for a lot of the women. There's one example that I give. We had one of our meetings, and our outreach worker was saying that a woman came to the drop-in center and said, can you write me a note that I can take home to my man, because he's going to want to know where I've been for the last hour. And we had a conversation about the ethical, the slippery slope that she was in. She said, now I can choose to not do it. She's like, but I won't see her again, because I'm sure he's gonna beat her up if she comes home and she's unaccounted for the last hour, and she doesn't have any money to show for it. So she's like, I can choose to not write the note, and we've had women that have asked the police when they get picked up by the cops, can you give me something that I can show them and say what happened to me? And the cops can't do it, they won't do it. But so the outreach worker said, they can not do it, and that's what'll happen. She's like, or I can, and I don't feel good about that either. She's like, I'm not going to enable this sort of relationship. But at the same time, she said, it's a greater burden to not see the woman again and worry that she either got beaten up or killed because she didn't have some way to account for her whereabouts. It doesn't happen all the time, but when it does, it's very difficult for the outreach workers to have to do that, because the women are in such a, and even when they're talking to them on the street, they're careful about where they have those conversations, because it's not uncommon for someone to be parked down the street watching her.
He's
watching to make sure.
He's going to
Yeah.
the community outreach worker if they continue to.
And that's why they're in pairs, and that's the other thing we have to think about too for our outreach workers, that they could be in, because they've been in the life, and they know who the women are. It takes them some usually that they're finding out from, so they see them down the street and they know they're being watched. Do you have someone that you stay with, that you bring money to, etc.? And so usually that's how we find out, is from the women. They'll actually say.
And, you search warrants, you still have the ladies in the still order. So it's kind of breaking that cycle, and you kind of trying to say, do you realize that, this is something that you don't have to do? And that there's benefits where Robin, she comes into play, and she actually gives them a breakdown of everything, that their rights and so forth and so on with that. So we're just kind of combining together.
Mm-hmm. And one thing we're doing in Milwaukee is we're partnering more with agencies that are working on youth sex trafficking, because once you say youth, that gets a lot of folks' attention, as it should, because the last thing you want is children involved in it. But we emphasize that we also want to focus on the women involved, because 10, 15, 20 plus years ago, those were the youth that were trafficked. Like I said, these are not women that, 18 years old, 21 years old when they decided to do this. For many of them, they've been trafficked as young girls. So we're trying to keep the focus on the women that we serve, so that they're not lost. A lot of times they're just seen as throwaway women, unfortunately. And I wanted to give a little bit of background. The Benedict Center in Milwaukee, I skipped ahead a couple of slides so I could get to this. The Benedict Center in Milwaukee is an organization now about 40 years old and focuses very exclusively in its programming on women in the criminal justice system. It's founded with these advocacy principles that women in criminal justice need services, whether it's healthcare, mental health, substance abuse programs, but really this emphasis on women that are in criminal justice. And the Women's Harm Reduction Program is sort of our overall program that the Sisters Project is part of. And we're proud to say it's the only holistic gender responsive program in Milwaukee for women as an alternative to correction. That's why the ATC acronym, alternative to correction. I emphasize the gender responsive piece because that's just so important in the programs that we have. We find that a lot of times in other programs that it's almost like sort of a one size fits all. And for the women in the program, there's just certain things that the women need. A lot of it is about relationships, how we relate to each other, and unfortunately for some of the women, that's the situation that they're in is due to being in bad relationships. And so we talk a lot about what it means as a woman and gender roles and how they can take better care of themselves in order to be in better relationship with their families or other individuals that are in their life. So we focus a lot on the women, and I think the program has done quite well in partnership with law enforcement because of that focus. So lifting up women's personal choice and realistic options. A lot of the women in our program don't feel like there's any other alternative. What I'm doing is it's what I do. There's nothing else. You don't have anything else for me, do you? So there's this idea that what they're doing is they feel that it's their only option.
Question.
Yes,
So
please.
the law enforcement pick these women up and then you take them to the alternative center? Is that, or they have a
Yes.
choice to do that, or do they write them a citation, or do they just take them to go to the system?
There are, I'll sort of paint the picture. The Sisters Project has two different components. One is a drop-in site that's located in the neighborhood that we serve in Milwaukee, on Milwaukee's west side. And then there's also the sort of the headquarters, so to speak, of the organization that's downtown, where a lot of the programs take place, the support groups, the ongoing programs. So, for example, a woman can come into the drop-in center in one of two ways. Either she comes in on her own, which is ideal, because maybe we've got street outreach workers that are out, they know the neighborhood. These are women that, as I said, used to be in the life, so they know a lot of the women, they know some of the men, whether they're the Johns or pimps, or the men that are controlling the women. So the street outreach workers can say, why don't you come in? And the drop-in center is not meant to be anything, pressuring for the women. It's just sort of a safe place to land, a soft spot to land. So a woman, she knows she can come in and just get something hot to eat. Milwaukee gets cold in the winter and it gets hot in the summer. And sometimes women just need a break. It's not a place to put too much pressure on them. Why don't you do this, or why don't you, leave, that sort of thing. But it's a place where a woman knows she can come in. She may see some of the other women that she knows, but maybe she just needs to rest. Maybe she just needs to get some sleep. Now, again, there's the control issue, so there's also the concern that if she's not accounted for that time, then what happens? But for women that do come in, ideally they're at least in a place where for that period of time they know they're in a safe place to do that. And then we've always got our outreach folks at the site just to talk to them, and that's how the relationship builds. But the other way that a woman can come in is by law enforcement. We've got a partnership with Milwaukee Police Department, 3rd District, and they're the only district in Milwaukee Police Department that has been this supportive of the project. They don't like the cycle that they see that's going on. However, in their end, good policing is arrests. So we have to, we're always sort of walking that careful line with them. Yet they realize that at least if they can bring the women in, there's a chance that they would then sign up for programs. One of the downsides if law enforcement is bringing her in, chances are it's because she just got a ticket or she just got arrested. And some of the women, you know, there's a little bit of a shakedown, unfortunately, for some of them. Maybe there was they don't use the word sweep anymore where we are, they call them deployments. And some people don't like that word either. It sounds too much like the military, deployments. But if they, you know, if they go through and they've picked up a few women, maybe they're sitting in the back of the van for a while, enough to get scared for some of them, or enough to come down perhaps if they were on a bit of a high. But if they're brought in by the police, then they're mad. You know, so that's also a trick. You know, you want to be able to engage with the women, but if you've just been arrested by the police and you haven't eaten, and like I said, perhaps you're coming down from something, the women are much angrier, understandably, in that sort of place. So thankfully, we've got outreach workers that understand that it's not a place to be judgmental, but at least they're there. And at least we know where they're not, which is on the street or in a place where they're not safe. So ideally, when the women that are in the drop-in center, over time, like I said, usually doesn't happen right away, but over time, if a woman then agrees to participate in longer programming, there's 6 months of programming that we provide through the Benedict Center. And if a woman is offered a diversion from the police department, from the district attorney's office, then she can get the 6 months of programming through the Sisters Project. And I'll talk through those. So these are the two different models. The criminal justice model that I talked about, a woman might receive a municipal ticket and a fine issued by law enforcement. That's at the city level, but it's not a cheap ticket. Usually it's about $600. So most folks aren't able to pay that. And if they go unpaid long enough, there's an arrest warrant that's issued, possible state charges, which, like I said, we really try to avoid if possible. And then the cycle continues. But in the diversion model with the Sisters Project, the ticket's held, but it's not issued if the woman agrees to 6 months at the Sisters Project. And what we found over time is that what can happen, at least technically, if a woman doesn't finish the program, they still could issue a warrant then for her arrest. It doesn't usually happen that way. Thankfully, we've been given a little bit of latitude because it can be a lot for a woman to go through 6 months of programming like that. But if a woman refuses the program altogether, then they can still go ahead and continue with the charge. So the street outreach that I mentioned, these are a couple. It's hard to tell, but these are a few of our outreach workers. But it focuses on building trusting relationships, respect, food, hygiene products. Sometimes it's condom distribution if that's what the women need.
Just trying to help.
Oh yeah, thanks. It's hard. It's like there's not an in between enough to see the picture. It's either completely on or completely off. The condom distribution, which is important, and that's something we also talk about with women in some of our groups, is the negotiation with that, because for the women sometimes they just make more money if they're not using condoms, or a man can refuse to use that, and she's not in a powerful enough position to insist on it. So that's very difficult for the women that are involved. And as I mentioned, encouragement to come to the drop-in center. So that's the first component. And next are some of the programs that are offered through the Sisters Project. On the bottom, we have some of the women that had come into the center and agreed to have their picture taken. I want to emphasize that. But just sort of, the camaraderie that can happen. Women, they know each other and they start to build those relationships. I think those women that are making some like condom packages that can easily be distributed to other women that are out. But we have the support groups, group classes to help women deal with violence they faced as children and adults. We've got one program that focuses on, that is more present focused. What are you going through right now, and how can they help lead the life? There's another program that we just started called Create and Change that is a little bit more intensive because it focuses on the past-focused trauma. It's very challenging. We've had to have at least three different facilitators for that particular group because it can just be so intense, and women have to be in a place where they're ready for that. That's really difficult. Some women have never even confronted some of those things that have happened, whether it's sexual abuse or past trauma. So women generally participate in full 6 months of programming before they're even at that place where we can talk about past traumatic relationships. But the key is the case management, We've got case managers at the Benedict Center that are helping women through all different phases of the program. For a lot of the women, it's job skills or getting their GED or perhaps even a college degree. Again, the key is how do we help women get to a place where they can safely exit where they're currently at. I'll give an example of, these are two of our, one is our outreach worker on the right, and then Donna on the left is the program director, and she's been with the Benedict Center for about 25 years. But one of the examples they gave is a young woman. She was 17 at the time, and she was picked up for prostitution and brought into the drop-in center. And she agreed to a diversion, because in Milwaukee you can be charged at 17. She would be charged as an adult. And it took a total of about 3 years before she finally completely exited. It was about 3 months of slow, coming in and out of the drop-in center. So we knew she'd been doing this for years, even though she was only 17. And Donna on the left had been working with her again, not pressuring her, but just sort of talking to this young woman over time. And she said, some of the things I was mentioning earlier. Well, what do you have that's better than what I'm doing right now? And Donna, finally, this young woman came in and she'd been beaten up pretty badly. And Donna said, "Can you please let me take you somewhere? I don't want to send you back to whoever you were with." We never found out who her was. But the young woman finally, after getting beaten up badly enough, it said, okay, and unfortunately in Milwaukee there were so few shelters available to bring her to. So we found a place in a nearby county to Milwaukee. Donna was what brought her out there, and she stayed there for about 2 months. This young woman was there for 2 months, and finally when she left, she came back to, and Donna stayed in contact with her this entire time. She was at a women's shelter there, and she said, well, I want something different, but I can't go back to the city again because I know I'm just going to get pulled right back in, because she had no place really to go. So Donna said, well, what we need to do then is, for you to still stay where you're at, but I'll work with you on getting your GED. Thankfully, she was still a young woman. She hadn't been doing this for 30 plus years. So get you GED, because she'd been out of school for a couple of years. We finally were able to get her housing in an area that was not close to where she'd been before, because we didn't want her anywhere close to the man that she had before she'd been arrested. And she was able to get a nice job at a retail outlet. She kept the job, still is there for about 8 months now, no longer than that, since October. And so we're always counting the days for her, because since October, that's a long time. And right away she said, she's like, well, I'm gonna need some help. She knew she had a substance abuse issue. She said, I'm going to need some help. If I'm on my own, I don't know that I'll be able to stay away from that completely. So we worked with a local substance abuse facility in Milwaukee, and we were able to get her into that program. But Donna, thankfully on the left, is someone that realizes how much you have to stay close to somebody, that it's not just enough to say, okay, well, we got you at the shelter, you feel pretty good, that's great. She needed that constant support and that case management model of how are you doing, what do you need, what else can we provide for you, and to not have her ever feel like she's going to get cut off at some point and that she's left on her own. So I think it's been, for Donna, it's really been a challenging journey, just walking with this young woman because of how many things she'd been dealing with. And it also showed us how long it can take. And she's 17, and it took 2 to 3 years, so we knew how long she'd been doing this. And Donna said, well, then how long do you think then it takes for somebody that it's the only thing they've been doing their whole life? So we use that as an example, even when working with law enforcement, when working with our grant funders, to say you've got to give us time for things like this to work, because it's so challenging. And yet for the women, the women do want to leave it. This is not something that a lot of folks want to keep doing. It's just that they're in a position where they either can't or don't know how to choose something different for themselves. So some of the outcomes, our drop-in center went from 4 to 22 hours a week before we really had any funding. We were working with a lot of people just volunteering their time, and that's a lot to ask folks to volunteer for, the type of work that it is. So with funding, we've been able to go to 22 hours a week. We also have a data collection tool, because before we've been doing a lot of things just paper, pencil. We do try to keep, when the street outreach workers are out, we like to keep track of who did you see today, how many times have you were able to talk to that young woman in the last, week or a few weeks or a month. Was there anything in particular that you offered? Sometimes we just make note, well, I saw fill in the blank today and I was able to give her, some snacks and some condoms, and I talked to her a little bit, encouraged her to come into the drop-in center. So we're able to track some of those things for ourselves and for our funders. And some of our outcomes so far, in 2013, just this past year, we've had 75 women that have come in to the drop-in center, and 168% in a total of 643 times by the outreach workers. So the 75 women are the ones that have come in either on their own or by law enforcement, but we know that our outreach workers are seeing 168. So there's still a lot of women that are there that we're still trying to get to come in. And this is a neighborhood of about 39,000 residents. So this is not the city of Milwaukee. This is one of the police districts on the west side of Milwaukee. And we've had 69 different referrals through police contact between 2011 and 2013. The vast majority are African American. Milwaukee's a very segregated city if you're not familiar. So the west side and north side of Milwaukee are primarily African American, and the near west side and the near south side of Milwaukee, which is primarily Latino, are the hot spots for prostitution in the city. And the age range is about 18 to 63, although as I mentioned in our programs, the average age for the women is in their early 40s. So reduce recidivism, those are the things that law enforcement is the first thing that they're interested in, understandably so. And we found for the women that have come into the Sisters Project, into the program, 42% received a new charge compared to Milwaukee County, which is more around 80%. So those are good numbers. We love it to be zero, but 42% is still for us, that's pretty good. And I emphasize that's new charge, so that could be anything. So it could be something minor or something major, so we still have to tease out what some of those numbers are. I'm sorry.
No, I was just saying that was good.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, 42%. And we've had 29 of the women met the 6-month requirement. But one thing we're excited about is that 15 have continued beyond the 6 months. That's voluntary. We don't ask that of the women. These are just folks that have said, I know I need more than just this, and they want to be able to stick with it. In looking at some of the data, the 2011 group was 16 times more likely to recidivate compared to those in 2012 and 2013. Now, I will emphasize with that, part of that could be that they've just had more time, basically, since 2011. But the key is that 2013 is when we were able to increase our outreach hours, the drop-in center hours, and the number of women involved in the outreach portion. So in a way, we want to see, that's sort of a pattern that's a good trend for us, is that the likelihood of recidivating is going down with each year as we're able to increase the number of services. And those with a criminal record were 15 times more likely, which is, we were, I guess, expecting to see that. So that's why we're so concerned with those that have had an extensive criminal history, because we know that can make someone more likely to have a new charge. But age group was not a significant predictor. We thought perhaps that maybe those that were really young or those that were much older might be less likely to recidivate, either because someone says, I don't want this, I've done this long enough, I don't want to continue this, or someone that's young enough and got scared enough to say, I wouldn't want this to continue. But age group wasn't necessarily a factor. I'm going to skip into some of the key lessons learned. One is the importance of collaboration and working with our community members, especially our business partners. For example, we've got a local bakery, and because it's a bakery, they come in early hours in the morning, 3 a.m. And finally, the owner had said he was getting frustrated coming in at 3 a.m., he and his wife, and there's this activity that's going on outside the bakery. He used to call the police all the time. And he said after a while, that's just not working. He said all they're doing is scaring the women, and he said, that's not what I want. I just want this to stop. So he started calling the outreach workers, and he said, would you mind coming in at those times just to talk to some of the women? And they've been doing that. And he said now when he calls the police on men that are driving by and not the women. So the outreach workers have been willing to come in at 3 a.m. just to sort of be, around the bakery, just to talk to some of the women that are there. Maybe women that were at that time that they wouldn't necessarily see at 6 p.m. So that's been a great partnership. That the bakery owner said, look, I just, I want the activity to stop, but I want the women to be safe. And so we've asked the women more about trafficking. We don't use that term, but asking the women more about who's in their life. Do you have someone that you live with, that you bring your money to, that sort of thing, because law enforcement is very much concerned about who the traffickers are. They don't get a diversion. I'll make sure I point that out. The traffickers are not offered any sort of deferred prosecution. They get the full arrest charge and everything. So we don't offer them that latitude. But what we found works is, one, as I mentioned, the outreach and the relationship building. When the outreach workers are out and engaging with the women, they know who they are a lot of times, and they build that trusting relationship. As I said, we found over time that the women have to be able to trust us. They've had no example of that in the past. They've never been able to trust anybody. So you think, well, why should we trust you all? We don't know you. How do we know that you're not going to do any more or less harm to me than what I've already faced? So we found the importance of the outreach and the relationship building, the gender responsive programming for the women, and the ongoing support and the resources, which is why we're so glad that some women are staying with the Sisters Project even beyond the 6 months of involvement. And the lessons learned, the 3 biggest for us is that the agencies need staff with the capacity for trauma-informed care. There's another agency in Milwaukee that has opened up that's doing some of this, but there's a lot of concern that frankly we don't know if they know what they're doing and how intense the work is. So that have the capacity to work with women that have been in traumatic relationships. The relationship building, not only with the women, but with businesses and community residents, and just the patience and resilience. It's hard on the outreach workers too. They hear some tough stories. They hear stories of women there was one woman that was working, and a car full of young men, probably young, I don't know if they were college kids but they were young men, and they stopped by and just threw eggs at this woman. Just stopped by and just peppered her with rotten eggs for no other reason other than they knew who she was, and they treated her like she was just nothing. And that's what some of the women face. As I mentioned before, it's not just the violence with the men that's controlling and rooting from the jobs, but it can just be from random folks that see them as a nobody. And that's what those are the stories that the outreach workers hear, and we're trying to find safe places even for them. Like, how do they process all of that? They've been in that life too, but how do you process when you're working with folks that have been through so much, and they need you to be able to share all of that, but they need some support themselves. So the patience and resilience for our outreach workers, I commend them intensely for what they do. And also that project success is defined differently by each partner. For our law enforcement partners, success for them is, in some cases, it's actually more arrests. If you have a police chief that says arrest numbers are up, that's great. We want to be able to say we're tough on crime. So, and for us, it's how are we helping the women over time? So for us, it's, we would love to see the arrests go down. But in some areas, especially, by districts, some districts will say, you actually are arresting people less. What's wrong with you? Why aren't you arresting people more? So we have to balance what is important to them, which is reduce recidivism. At the end of the day, that's one thing that they care about, and we care about that too. We don't want women incurring any new charges. So we found some middle ground there with reduced recidivism. But then for us, what's most important is the safety of the women. Celebrating success. We have a program every single month for those that have either finished their GED or anything that's meaningful to women. The case managers sit down with each individual and say, what's important to you? What is something that you would see as a success in your life? Is it that you got your kids back? Is it that you were able to finish school? Is it that you got a job or you found a place to live? Whatever it is for her, that's what we celebrate. And that's I think that's what's important for any program like this, is finding those things for each individual and celebrating those. And finally, some few implications, I think, for the work that we're doing is that prostitution and sex trafficking obviously is very complex, requires system-wide response. It's not just what you're doing at the organization, but how are you working with law enforcement? How are you working with businesses? We make it clear we can't do this work without partnering with the police department and with the community prosecutor. There's no way we can make this work without them. We don't see them as the enemy. They don't see us as a problem. So it's about how do we build those partnerships. And situating the work and the advocacy in context of race and gender. I'm a sociologist, so that's kind of how I think anyway. But part of it is about healing these traumatic relationships, but I also think a lot of, most of the women we work with are Black women. And I think about the larger implication of what does it say about the value of the Black woman's body when this is how some of our women are being treated. What does it say for 15-year-old Black girls that are standing waiting for the bus and there's a man propositioning them? What does that say to you as a young woman to say, is that what my body is worth, or is that what I'm worth, that you think that that's what I'm available for? So we talk about that a lot, and what does that mean for African American women, and how do we situate our advocacy work so that women are lifted up in a better way than that? And addressing the underlying trauma is critical, especially for women that have a long criminal history.
What's your demographics? What's the demographics there?
In Milwaukee, the city, now Wisconsin, African Americans are only about 5% of the population. In Milwaukee, we're about 45%. So when people usually ask, well, are there Black folks in Wisconsin? It's like, yes, there are, but we're mostly in Milwaukee. This is the largest city, 45%, and it's approximately 30-some% Latino. So it's primarily African American and Latino in Milwaukee, and maybe around 20-some% white. But Milwaukee, like I said, is very segregated. So it's the near west side, the near north side that are predominantly African American. We're working on the near west side. Thank you for the question. Yes, please.
I had a question as far as with law enforcement and with the women that you guys work with, because it's different down here in New Orleans. I know it's like probable cause is if a woman has so many commas in her pocket, and I know that's the same thing other places. And also we see the trend of this human trafficking. Everybody's saying human trafficking, and they are now charging these women who are prostitutes who just didn't give up a name or something like that, and saying, well, you're the human trafficker because, or you're the pimp or something like that because they didn't give up a name. I'm just, when it comes to working with law enforcement and then also saying, hey, we're here to help you, how do you earn that trust with these women? Because sometimes they just see, like, I can see them seeing that they can be re-victimized, and you guys may have set them up for it.
Yeah, they can easily see our work or our workers as an extension of law enforcement, especially law enforcement's the one bringing them into the drop-in center, which is why I said that's not always the ideal way to have the women come in. And I think, first, the partnership with law enforcement for us has started at the district level. It's tougher to start with, perhaps the police chief because, just of the hierarchy. So we started with the district that where we're working and building that relationship with the captain. And I will say that our captain changed during this project, and we noticed the difference. We had a captain that was all on board and got it and understood it. Then the next captain, we had to do some work partnering with him to see, to appreciate what we were doing. And it's worked, it's getting there with this particular police captain, but it does take some time because you're right. And some of the women have been charged with trafficking because they were the bottom girl, so to speak. They've been out and they're, perhaps they might be bringing in more girls for their pimp.